Hey everyone, and welcome back. In an earlier video, we briefly introduced the concept of food sovereignty, primarily to differentiate between food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. In this video, I want to explore the idea of food sovereignty in a bit more detail. The idea of food sovereignty has its roots in the work of Via Campesina, the peasant's way, a global movement of peasants, small and medium farmers, landless people, rural women, and indigenous communities from around the world. Via Campesina introduced the concept of food security in the mid-1990s, framing it as the right of peoples to define their own food and agricultural systems. The philosophical foundations of the idea of food sovereignty drew from three broad theoretical frameworks. Post-colonial theorists like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said examine the lasting impacts of colonialism on former colonies, particularly how these impacts continue to shape political, economic, and social structures. In the context of the idea of food sovereignty, post-colonial theorists like Vandana Shiva highlight how colonial histories disrupted indigenous agricultural practices, imposed monoculture systems, and created dependencies on imported food. The work of dependency theorists like André Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, and Theotonio dos Santos argue that developed countries exploit developing countries, leading to persistent economic dependencies and underdevelopment. In the context of agriculture, dependency theory underscores the vulnerability of developing nations in the global food market and argue that reducing dependency on global trade, promoting local production, and ensuring self-sufficiency are critical to maintaining a resilient food system. Finally, environmental justice focuses on the fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, emphasizing the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on marginalized communities. Theorists like Winona LaDuke argue that food sovereignty and its emphasis on sustainable agricultural practices, protection of natural resources, and ensuring that marginalized communities have access to healthy, sustainable food are all central components of environmental justice. But it was the 2007 Declaration of Nyéléni that fully articulated the concept of food sovereignty into a coherent platform, providing a comprehensive definition of the concept. The declaration, named after a legendary Malian peasant woman who farmed and fed her village well, was the outcome of a conference that brought together more than 500 representatives from 80 different countries. The declaration asserts that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations. It defends the interests and inclusion of the next generation. It offers a strategy to resist and dismantle the current corporate trade and food regime, and directions for food, farming, pastoral, and fisheries systems determined by local producers. Food sovereignty prioritizes local and national economies and markets, and empowers peasant and family farmer-driven agriculture, artisanal fishing, pastoralist-led grazing, and food production, distribution, and consumption based on environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Food sovereignty promotes transparent trade that guarantees just incomes to all peoples and the right of consumers to control their food and nutrition. It ensures that the rights to use and manage our lands, territories, waters, seeds, livestock, and biodiversity are in the hands of those of us who produce food. Food sovereignty implies new social relations free of oppression and inequality between men and women, peoples, racial groups, social classes, and generations. From this and the remainder of the text, we can identify 6 pillars that comprise food sovereignty. First, it recognizes food as a human right, that all peoples and communities, regardless of their socioeconomic status, location, or cultural background, have a right to food. In doing so, it rejects the idea of food merely as a commodity and emphasizes its role in human well-being, cultural identity, and social relations, and calls for food systems that prioritize the needs of people over the profits of corporations and market demands. Second, it recognizes and respects the critical role of food providers, including peasants, family farmers, pastoralists, fisher folks, indigenous peoples, and rural workers. It values their knowledge, skills, and traditions, which it asserts are essential for sustainable and culturally appropriate food production, and calls for policies that support and empower food providers, ensuring their access to land, resources, and fair compensation for their labor. Third, the Declaration emphasizes the importance of localizing food systems, promoting local production, processing, distribution, and consumption. It encourages local markets, short supply chains, and direct connections between producers and consumers in order to strengthen local economies, reduce dependence on external inputs, and enhance community resilience. As a result, it advocates for local control over food systems, giving communities the power to determine their own food and agricultural policies. It challenges the concentration of power in the hands of transnational corporations and global institutions, and instead calls for local autonomy and self-determination rooted in democratic decision-making processes that involve all stakeholders, especially food producers and consumers. Fifth, the Declaration recognizes the importance of knowledge and skills in sustainable food production and consumption. It values traditional ecological knowledge, often called TEK, which is passed down through generations, as well as scientific knowledge that supports agroecological practices. And it calls for educational programs and capacity-building initiatives that empower individuals and communities to make informed decisions about their food systems. Finally, it emphasizes the need to work with nature, respecting ecological principles and biodiversity, advocating for agroecological practices that promote soil health, water conservation, and the use of renewable resources. And it rejects industrial agriculture's reliance on chemical inputs, monocultures, and genetically modified organisms, which it maintains harms both the environment and human health. Since the Declaration of Nyéléni, the concept of food sovereignty has continued to evolve and expand. In part, this is a reflection of the belief that food sovereignty is not an end goal, but an ongoing process of building resilient, democratic, and sustainable food systems. It continues to emphasize the right to food as a fundamental human right. A greater emphasis has been placed on understanding food through an intersectional lens, recognizing how race, gender, class, and other social categories impact access to food and control over food systems. In particular, greater emphasis has been placed on the role of women in food production and the need for gender equity in agricultural practices and policies, and on acknowledging the crucial role of Indigenous knowledge and practices in achieving food sovereignty and to protect these communities' rights. The movement has also expanded to address the impacts of climate change on food systems, advocating for agroecology as an approach to help ensure resilient agricultural practices and policies that mitigate environmental damage and promote climate justice. The movement has also expanded into urban contexts, emphasizing the importance of community gardens, urban farms, and local food networks as important components of urban food sovereignty. And finally, the movement has started to gain influence in international policies, particularly through its advocacy work at the United Nations and other global forums. We see a number of concrete examples. Adopted in 2018, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, or UNDROP, explicitly recognizes the rights of peasants and rural workers, including their rights to land, seeds, and biodiversity, and emphasizes the need for states to support small-scale farmers and protect their traditional knowledge and practices, all core principles of food sovereignty. The Committee on Food Security, a UN platform for reviewing and following up on food security and nutrition policies, has also integrated food sovereignty principles into its agenda. Through the inclusion of civil society organizations and farmers groups, the CFS has advocated for policies that support smallholder farmers, promote sustainable agriculture, and ensure local communities have control over their food systems. The International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, often referred to simply as the Seed Treaty, promotes the conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources, acknowledging the right of farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-saved seed, thus supporting the autonomy of local communities over their genetic resources. The Food and Agriculture Organization's Agroecology Initiative promotes policies and practices that support biodiversity, improve soil health, and reduce dependency on chemical inputs, aligning with the food sovereignty principle of working with nature. More broadly, the food sovereignty movement has successfully reframed the right to food as a human right, moving the conversation beyond mere food security and access to food to encompass issues of control, self-determination, and cultural appropriateness. This has influenced the work of UN agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization and the Human Rights Council. Indeed, the United Nations even has a special rapporteur on the right to food. And that debate has migrated to the national level, with a handful of countries, including Bolivia, Ecuador, Mali, and others, ensuring the right to food in their national constitutions. and we also see a variety of other movements embracing food sovereignty as a central organizing principle. In Brazil, the Landless Workers Movement, or MST, has emerged to become one of the largest social movements in Latin America, advocating for land reform and the rights of landless workers. MST organizes landless workers to occupy unused or underutilized land, pressuring the government to redistribute it to poor rural families. These occupations have led to the settlement of thousands of families on millions of hectares of land. MST also promotes agroecological practices and sustainable farming methods that prioritize environmental health and food sovereignty, operating hundreds of collective farms and agroecological schools, training farmers to engage in sustainable agriculture, and empowering communities to maintain control of their food systems. In Malawi, the agroecology movement has garnered popular support from the National Smallholder Farmers Association of Malawi to promote agroecological practices like intercropping, organic fertilization, and conservation agriculture. Schools organized by the Farmers Association provide hands-on training and knowledge exchange among farmers, promoting the adoption of sustainable farming methods and strengthening local food systems. These practices are less resource-intensive, providing important benefits for smallholder farmers, while also improving soil health, increasing biodiversity, and enhancing resilience to climate change. And in Canada, Indigenous communities are promoting food sovereignty initiatives to restore traditional food practices and ensure access to healthy, culturally appropriate foods. Initiatives such as the Eelground First Nations Community Garden and the Fishwicks Project, Fisheries, Western, and Indigenous Knowledge Systems, aim to combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern science to manage local fisheries in a sustainable manner. And community gardens grow traditional crops and medicinal plants, serving as educational tools to pass on traditional knowledge and skills. These examples demonstrate the diverse ways in which food sovereignty is being implemented around the world, highlighting the importance of local control, sustainable practices, and the empowerment of marginalized communities in creating resilient and equitable food systems. While food sovereignty presents a compelling vision for a more just and sustainable food system, it also faces several significant limits and challenges. First, and arguably the most important, they often face considerable opposition from national governments and global institutions, which frequently prioritize industrial agriculture and agribusiness over small-scale farming due to economic incentives, lobbying, and political influence. Policies and subsidies frequently favor large-scale operations, making it difficult for small-scale farmers to compete. This is compounded by international trade agreements and policies, which often undermine food sovereignty by promoting free trade and liberalization of agricultural markets. These agreements can lead to dumping of cheap agricultural products in developing countries, which can devastate local farmers and food systems, and often create an unequal field on which small farmers are forced to compete against massive international conglomerates. Control over seeds, input and output markets by multinational corporations restrict farmers' ability to save and exchange seeds. Indeed, one of the major points of contention in international negotiations focuses on how to balance plant breeders' rights against farmers' rights. Corporate consolidation in other input markets and processing, a phenomenon we explore in another video, also presents problems for realizing food sovereignty. There are also a variety of social and cultural barriers to food sovereignty. Shifting consumer preferences towards convenience, processed foods, and globalized diets can make it difficult to promote local, traditional food systems. And many consumers lack awareness of the benefits of food sovereignty or may not be willing to pay higher prices for local, sustainable food. And in some communities, traditional food systems may be seen as outdated or backwards, leading to a loss of cultural knowledge and practices essential for food sovereignty. Finally, scaling up food sovereignty to meet the demands of large populations, particularly in urban areas or areas with limited agricultural potential, also presents challenges for the movement. But that's it for now. As always, please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.